Good evening and welcome to another Candid conversation. We are so happy that you were able to join us for tonight's discussion. Quick PSA before we get started. Please remember to type in your question in either the comment box or in the link found in the description box. After our speaker is done, they will then answer your questions, which will prove to be difficult if there are no questions to answer. So please remember that a conversation requires more than one person, so do your part. With that being said, relax, type in your question, and let's have a conversation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 6. Oh, no, episode 7. What am I talking about? Welcome to episode 7 of Candid Conversations. Thank you so much for the questions that you send in from week to week. Thank you so much for the way in which you have been engaging us. I know that you have been sharing these. We're getting really good feedback, and we want to encourage you to continue to do so. I want to talk about how do we know when God is speaking to us and how do we know it's his voice? We live inside the reality of communication. Our whole life is inside the reality of communication. We live in actually the communication age, but the biblical world is a world that is no different. The biblical world exists within a whole world of communication. Creation takes place through communication. When the phenomenon of sin is entered into this world or enters into our reality and breaks the relationship between us and God, that is done through the process of communication. When redemption and hope comes through the first question, where are you? Did you do what you weren't supposed to do? Can you fix it? Do you want me to fix it? All of that is communicated through words, through the process of communication. The Bible records God as being in consistent and constant communication with humanity. That is consistent through the biblical narrative, in communication with those who know him and in communications with those who didn't know him. And when I say didn't know him, just didn't know him personally, didn't worship him. They worshiped their gods, but we didn't worship that God. Because the biblical world, the ancient biblical world, is a complete world in which the divine is believed. Therefore, the divine is sought after. And by extension, the divine is seen as speaking to human beings. The guiding principle in both worlds being, but especially through the biblical world, the guiding principle being that God is in the business of knowing and making himself known to humanity. But how do we know when God is speaking to us? How do we know when God is speaking to us? Well, the question that I ask is, well, what conversation are you already engaged with the divine? Actually, do you have an expectation that there is to be a conversation with the divine, that there is to be a two-way conversation? Do you know that conversations can only be had when it's two-way? Are you aware of the fact that God does speak? And are you aware of where he speaks and through who and through what he speaks? Humans understand communications to be both verbal and non-verbal, and that we are communicated through all 5 of our senses, through sight, through hearing, through sound, through touch, through taste. These are our senses. So when you read Isaiah chapter 6, and Isaiah says, in the day that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord lift high and lifted up. Read through those first verses of Isaiah chapter 6. And I'm not going to tell you where, but read through and you will see that all 5 senses of Isaiah, all 5 of Isaiah's senses are engaged in this communication. That the communication between God and humanity goes as far as engaging all our senses, which means that the communication that God wants to have with us is personal. It is intimate. Read 1 Kings 19, and there's a story of Elijah in a very depressed state, hiding out in a cave, and God asks him, what are you doing here? Then God makes himself known to Elijah. God makes himself known to Elijah, and he makes himself known to Elijah by acting in ways that he's always acted. There was thunder, and there was wind, and there was earthquake. But Elijah kept on saying, but I didn't hear God speak. I saw the things that God normally does, and I didn't hear God speak. He said, and then God finally spoke. And God spoke this low. And why did God speak that low? Because when somebody speaks that low to you, they have to be all the way in your ear and in your personal space, because the conversation now becomes personal. The conversation now becomes intimate. The conversation now is one-on-one, and they want you to hear. Because when people whisper, you have to not only hear, but you have to listen. There's a pattern. There's a pattern. There is a pattern that presents itself with God when it comes to God communicating with human beings. And that has to do with the revelation of God to us and our redemption. The two of them go hand in hand. When God is seeking to speak to us as human beings, it has to do with the revelation of God and has to do with our redemption. And when I say our redemption, us coming back to God. So how do we know when God is speaking? Well, from the biblical examples. Look at the biblical examples. You know that God is speaking because people are always pulled outside of their comfort places. God always goes into your deepest comfort zone. You know why people are never ready when God speaks? Because God never speaks at a time when we are ready for him to speak. God always knows that whenever he speaks, it's an inconvenience to the people. People have other plans. One man said to Jesus, Jesus, I want to follow you, but first let me go bury my father. And Jesus said, man, let the dead bury the dead. Now, Jesus wasn't being dismissive. Jesus was actually using that as it was a colloquialism. The guy wasn't really saying that, my daddy's dead. He was just basically saying, Jesus, I want to follow you, but I've got lots of stuff to do right now. Jesus was like, man, let the dead bury the dead. Let that busy stuff come and follow me. People are always pulled outside their comfort spaces in the biblical narrative when God is speaking. Conversations with God seem to center around the well-being of others. God is never just speaking to people, specifically just about themselves. He addresses who they are, he addresses where they are, but he's always speaking to them in relation to a bigger picture. The big picture is never the individual. The big picture is always the community in which God speaks. In the biblical narratives, that God is speaking because God is always driving us as human beings towards equity and justice and fairness in our dealings with other people, in our dealings with other human beings. God is always pushed towards that. And that God is speaking through the biblical narrative. God is speaking to people because God conversations are always transformative, either in nature or as an end result. They're always transformative. The zealot, the killer of Christians, whose name was Saul, was on his way to actually imprison Christians in another city when Jesus stops him on the road to Damascus. Jesus said to him, Paul, why are you fighting against me? It's hard to go against your conscience, isn't it? It's hard to kick against the things in your soul that Paul knew it was God who was speaking. He said, Lord, who are you? And Paul heard 3 words. I am Jesus. Oh. When Paul heard that, that conversation was transformative. He was forever changed. He was forever changed. So we know when God is speaking from the biblical examples, when you're pulled outside of yourself, when conversations seem to constantly center around the well-being of others, when God is consistently driving you towards equity and justice and fairness for others, when the conversation is transformative, when your life is being transformed for the better, for the greater, for the purer as a result of that conversation. So where is God's voice to be heard? Well, God's voice is to be heard through his word. God speaks through the Bible. God speaks through this little tiny book. He speaks through this little tiny book. We still believe that God speaks through the Bible, but also God speaks through people. Not just in the Bible. You know, the Bible is the example that God still speaks through people. God speaks through your conscience, your intuition, your gut. In the Bible, it's called enmity. He speaks through that side of you that is never going to be totally given over to wrong, never totally given over to evil, never totally given over to something impure. He's always going to speak through that side. God speaks through nature. And I pointed out there because outside of my window here, there is so much greenery and it's actually beautiful to look at. He speaks through nature. But the clearest that God has ever communicated to human beings is in and through the life and the person of Jesus Christ. If you really want to know God's voice into the human story, you need to read the narratives, read the New Testament narratives in the gospel of the life of Jesus Christ and put yourself in that picture and hear God speak into your experience. You ask, how do I know it's his voice? How do I know it's his voice? Well, this is the one thing that we do know. Christianity is a lived experience rooted and grounded in the life of the man, Jesus Christ. And we also believe that Jesus is alive today. On this 8th day of April 2020, we believe Jesus to be alive. And if he is still alive and we believe him to be alive, then his voice through his word, through people, through experiences, through the community is going to be as clear and important as it's ever been. There isn't going to be no contradiction. So are you being pulled deeper? Are you being pulled into a place that is deeper and beyond more than just your own personal desire and your own personal game plan? Are you being convicted to let go and step back in order to make room for something greater? In order to make room for somebody who should be in that space? Are you hearing a voice telling you, listen, it's time for you to just let go and forgive? Stop chasing forgiveness in somebody that's never going to forgive you. It's time for you to let go. Are you propelled to live beyond you and make space for something greater that is trying to live out of you? Are you being propelled to go further, to reach higher, to believe finally, to dig deeper, to love again? If the answer to that is yes, chances are Jesus is speaking to you. Chances are you are hearing the voice of God. It was my mother who taught me to know God's voice. It was my mother who taught me to know God's voice. I saw in her life that God speaks directly and clearly into human lives and into human beings. And literally, I saw in her lived example countless manifestations of the times in which, and the places in which God literally spoke. I saw when, as a teenager, I was giving my mother hell. I saw the dreams that God sent my mother at night. about things I would go through a year and 6 months before they happened, so that when I went through them, because of my behavior, she wouldn't be overwhelmed because she had already seen it. She had actually told me about it so that I could have prior warning. But as a headstrong teenager, I just went strong into it anyway, in my reckless 20s. But I saw how God did that. Ultimately, I learned to trust his voice in her life and in her experiences, and I learned to develop my capacity to hear his voice. I learned to develop my capacity to hear his voice. And how do you develop that capacity? Well, in 4 ways. Number 1, put yourself in the spaces and the environments where God clearly speaks. Put yourself around people reading his word. Put yourself around communities of faith committed to living. Put yourself around praying people committed to living the experiences of Jesus in their life. Put yourself around healthy, moral people. Number 2, have enough maturity to understand and know that Jesus speaks through more than just religious communities. Jesus speaks through more than just Christian communities. Have the maturity to understand that. Because when you have the maturity to understand that, you'll be able to hear him speak in lots of places. I hear him speak in the sacred and in the secular, because I've learned to hear his voice. Number 3, if you want to develop the capacity to hear God's voice, stop listening for only what you want to hear from God. If you're a parent, you know how you are with your child. If you're an uncle, you know. If you're a teacher with no children, you know how you are with your students. You understand, like, no, you can't have your way in everything. Stop coming to me for only what you want to hear, because I can see a bigger picture for you. The same is with us with God. Stop listening for only what you want to hear from God. And lastly, once you've heard, develop the skill and the capacity of believing and continuing to listen through the distractions of life that seek to pull you away from what is settled in your heart. What is my prayer for you? My prayer is that you may not only come to the realization that God is intentionally seeking to make himself known to you, but may you also experience that intentionality in your lived experience. That is my prayer for you. Hi, everyone. Listen, thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you for journeying with us. I'm going to encourage you to continue to joining the conversation. We want to encourage you to continue to be a part of what it is that we're doing here. So we have 2 questions. Number 1, how can I be sure that someone that says God told me to tell them, or God told them to tell me something, is really from God? You know, I think you have to have the level of maturity and honesty in your own life. You know, my mom would say, I dreamt something about you. Yeah, let me use my mom, for instance. My mom would, I'd be busy in my life as a minister, busy in my life, getting on with what I'm getting on with. And my mom would come and she'd call me and she'd say, Eddie, I dreamt something about you. Now, in our family, when my mom used to say, I dreamt something about you, everybody just stopped what they were doing. If I was driving, I would literally pull my car over, because I knew that God spoke directly to my mother. And I said, Mom, it's a good dream or a bad dream? She said, no, it's a good dream. I said, hold on a second, pull back out, and I just want to just drive with that dream. But I had the clarity to know that when my mom would say random things to me, they always related to what was going on in my life, my personal space, going on within my inner space, within my mind, or that was troubling me in my spirit. Just because somebody says God told them something to tell you, that doesn't make them a messenger from God. But remember, God speaks through community too. God may put something on in their mind or in their spirit, or knowing you and knowing your journey, they may be thinking and they hear God say something to them. And so if somebody comes to you and says, God told me to tell you something, is it really from God? Well, how does it measure up with your life? How does it measure up with your life? How does it measure up with your public space and your private inner space? At the same time, this person, how does their relationship measure up with you? Is this a person that you're just totally in an antagonistic relationship? Because I know that Christians have the ability to other God, noun God, not other him, noun him. A noun is a person, place, or thing that you use to actually describe something else, or you use to bring into a situation. We noun God. We noun God when we want to just completely trash somebody's life. So I think you have to weigh up all of those things. You have to weigh up all of those things together. But leave yourself. I've discovered this in my life. Just because somebody doesn't have the right to speak truth to you, it doesn't mean that the truth that they speak is invalid. Because if they speak truth to you, truth is still truth. They may not have earned the right to say it to you, or even the way in which they said it to you. But if it's the truth, then let it be the truth and embrace that. Let it be the truth and take that in. Let it be the truth and hear it. Second question is, are there prophets that God speaks through in today's day and age? Yeah. What was the role of the prophet? The role of the prophet in biblical times was to call the people back to justice and equity, was to call the people back to righteousness, spiritual righteousness, social righteousness. The job of the prophet was to let people know that God expected more of them. Whether that prophet was a prophet in Israel, or whether that prophet was a prophet in Israel that spoke to another group of people. So are there prophets that speak today? Anytime a minister stands up, anytime a member stands up, anytime a person stands up and is calling you back to a life of equity, to think about your neighbor, to consider the way in which you are living, to consider the way in which you allow yourself to be guided by constructs that devalue the life and the humanity of another human being. Anytime you stand in opposition to that and lift up the name and invoke the name of God in standing in opposition to that, you are one of these prophets. You are a prophet. Martin Luther King was a prophet. Malcolm X was a prophet. They called people to a higher standard of living. They called people to consider the social and the racial inequities in which they existed. Mother Teresa was a prophet. They challenged through their life and through their journeys what they saw around them, and called us and reminded us of our responsibility to do the same. Question: if he speaks, and the questions come from YouTube, if God speaks, you hear, and choose to ignore what is said or what you have to do, if something goes wrong later, can you fix that? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do you think God is? Well, you didn't listen to me this time. All right, fire on you, and he can't fix. I mean, of course he can fix. It doesn't mean that the problems that come as a result of not hearing, you're not going to experience. It doesn't mean that the trauma and the drama or the breakdown or whatever it is that you experience as a result of not listening, it doesn't mean that that you're not going to experience that. But as you head forward, you can still grow from that. You can still learn to be a stronger you from that. You can still learn to be a better informed you, a deeper spiritual you. You can still use your experience to help somebody else along their way so that they don't fall into the same rabbit hole. The story of the prodigal son is a prime example of that. Prime example of that. That when you are even in the pig pen, you can still come to yourself. The story says he came to himself and said, you know what, I'm going home. I'm going to tell my father, I have sinned. I am no more worthy to be called your son. Just make me a servant. But his father saw him a long way off, ran to him so that everybody else wouldn't see him before he got home, so that they would shame him. What did the father do? The father fell on his neck and embraced him and kissed him. Then the son said, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. He never was able to get out, I am no more worthy to be called that, no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me a servant. He was born a son. You're born a son. You're born a daughter. The Father ain't about making you a servant. You weren't never born a servant. The Father is about restoring you. It doesn't mean that the pig pen experience that he went through and all the bad experiences have changed. What it meant was from here, he was no longer defining himself by those mistakes. The pig pen had written him off, but God wrote into his life with a bigger pen. Wrote into his life with a bigger pen. I love the biblical narrative. You know why I love it? I love the biblical narrative because it's not a fairy tale. It's actually about human beings like me. It's about human beings that I've seen. It's about the type of human being that I've been. And I love the way God stays in the narrative with us. So follow us in these Candid conversations. Continue to follow us. Continue to share them. Look out for Pastor Bobby on Sunday. Oh, been loving his presentations. And I will be with you next Thursday evening. Share. Did I say share? One more time. Share. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us this evening for Candid Conversation. If you love what you saw here tonight, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as turn on your bell notifications so that way you know every time we go live. Have any questions? Be sure to click the link in our description box and let us know your thoughts. And remember, ain't no judgment on this side. Also, be sure to like, comment, and share us on all of your social media platforms so that way your friends and family can be a part of the community as well and stay in the know of everything here at Mount Pisgah. See you next time.